Welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives. It's the 6th of July, 2025, and we are going to hear about the book Ecofeminism by Vandana Shiva and Maria Mies. And we're hearing it being discussed by Aurora, Linnea, and Lierre Keith. So thanks very much, and over to you two.
Wonderful. Good morning. I'm very pleased to be here with Lierre Keith this morning to discuss this book, Ecofeminism, which is a collection of essays published in 1993 by Maria Mies and Vandana Shiva. Maria Mies, or Mies, has been featured on this program before, as she's also the author of the book Patriarchy and Accumulation on a World Scale, Women in the International Division of Labor, which is probably her most well-known and often read book. Mies, born in 1931, was a German sociologist, professor, feminist author, and activist. Her background is very much rooted in a Marxist analysis, but her work really develops a far more radical analysis of women's oppression than is typical of Marxist feminism. Her writing and activism centered around pivots of connection between patriarchy, capitalism, and colonialism, always paying a keen attention to the struggles of women and how these related to the struggles of colonized people globally. She taught in India during the 1960s, which gave her a view into the position of women subject to colonial and patriarchal oppression, as well as that strange singular hybrid that is colonial patriarchy. Mies became involved in the ecofeminist movement in the 1980s and was active in organizing against genetic engineering, reproductive technology, militarism, and nuclear armament. She died at the age of 91 in 2023, so just a few years ago. The co-author of this book is Vandana Shiva, who was born in 1952, and she is an Indian environmentalist and feminist activist, a philosopher of science, a leader in the agroecology movement, and the founder of Navdanya, a woman-centered, farmer-led organization that promotes sustainable food systems, biodiversity, and conservation in agriculture through seed saving. Shiva began her career as a physicist, actually in quantum physics, interestingly enough, but later shifted her focus to the study of science, technology, and environmental policy. She is an astonishingly prolific writer, having authored or edited nearly a book per year since her first, which was Staying Alive, Women, Ecology, and Survival in India, was published in 1988. So how we're going to organize this presentation this morning is we've each chosen some different chapters in the book or essays, and I'm going to present on my choices, and then we'll move on to Lierre. And so the first essay that I chose is by Vandana Shiva, and it is titled Reductionism and Regeneration, a Crisis in Science. In this essay, Shiva argues against the common assumption that science is value-free, totally neutral, and non-ideological, instead proposing that modern science as we know it is itself in ideology, not neutral at all, but permeated by the values and the ethos of the culture that produced it. It's an artifact of Enlightenment-era Europe's scientific revolution and adheres to the same reductive mechanistic paradigm that guided that cultural movement. Shiva calls it, quote, a Western male-oriented and patriarchal projection, which necessarily entails the subjugation of both nature and women. Reductionism deprives the natural world of all its liveliness, dynamism, and integrity. The substance of creation is reconceived as inert matter, everything fragmented and held separate from everything else. Machine metaphors dominate in reductionist descriptions of the world, with blood vessels likened to pipes and seeds to factories. Shiva lists reductionism's key assumptions as uniformity, atomization, or isolation, so the view of things as discrete rather than interdependent, mechanization, divisibility, abstraction, and objectivity. All of these assumptions emanate from a patriarchal view of nature as existing for man, created for him, hence subordinate to him, in much the same way that women, who come to symbolize nature and the natural in man-made culture, exist to be used by men, and in the Christian paradigm, were created for men, out of men. And all of these are used to justify and facilitate men's efforts to dominate women and nature alike. As Shiva writes, quote, reductionist science is a source of violence against nature and against women, insofar as it subjugates and dispossesses them of their full productivity, power, and potential. She identifies this mode of thought as the root of the growing ecological crisis, which is no longer so much growing as wholly fulminant, in that it transforms nature into materials that are useful to men by means of disintegration and destruction. Every earthly substance or being that is not man becomes a resource for him, and nothing has any value until he makes use of it. For Shiva, this mentality represents the philosophical grounding for modern science. Its technical counterpart then is the Industrial Revolution, which enabled the efficient mass conversion of earthly creation into valuable products. The economic face of this cultural development would be capitalism, by which nature, already reduced to a resource, is fractured into an endless stream of commodities, abstracted into profits, and consumed. Nature is not productive in itself. Men are the productive ones as they go about their bustling business of rendering the world into products to buy and sell. Shiva writes, quote, the sources of regeneration and renewal of life are transformed into mere raw material to be processed into a finished product. The transformation of the earth's creativity into passivity relocates productivity in men's disruptive, coercive, and exploitative acts, and defines it as a source of value. Through this relocation of production and value, external control over sites of regeneration becomes not just desirable, but necessary for human survival and well-being. The destructive, ironically, emerges as the savior. As an example of this kind of redefinition and expropriation of creativity by the male masters of the scientific method, Shiva points to the medicalization of childbirth. In the medical model, it's the doctor and not the mother who is deemed the expert on giving birth. It's the doctor who ushers the baby into the world with the help of his machines, which are other men's inventions. Shiva doesn't get into this so much, but Jenna Correa, in her amazing book, 1980s book, The Mother Machine, shows how male doctors have looked upon the female body as the most dangerous place for a child. Their mission then is to rescue innocent babies from the dark and clutching abyss of the terrible mother, that age-old and consistent patriarchal myth. It's obvious from their descriptions that they consider themselves quite heroic for their efforts. Today, reproductive technologies like IVF and surrogacy, along with ongoing research in the pursuit of a completely externalized, disembodied genesis within Ursat's mechanical wombs, puts this imagined role of the doctor as the leading man in the drama of reproduction into an even starker light. The man of science is the productive one, and with his technical know-how and mastery of machines, he creates as well as ushers into the world the child. Well, the woman is the raw material as a source of eggs or as a rental womb, who should look to her doctor as the ultimate authority and be grateful when he heroically wrests a living baby from her troublesome and deadly body. Similarly, in the context of colonialism and global capitalism, indigenous, tribal, and non-industrialized people's labor, skills, and knowledge is dismissed and diminished. Once again, Western science and technology must swoop in to salvage them into something productive, and what is produced, of course, are various exciting new commodities, the profits from which go to corporations and colonial states, inevitably, and not the people who were the source of them. Shiva identifies three major accomplishments of such scientific industrial colonialization, whether it's being imposed onto women or indigenous people. The first is that any and all contribution by the colonized whose products are appropriated is denied. The second is that the view of appropriation as improvement valorizes theft and exploitation. The third is that the colonized group's attempts to reclaim resources, which include their own bodies, can be plausibly framed as criminal interference into the profit-making pursuits of the colonizer and punished accordingly by the colonizer's system of law. In these ways, the reductionism of modern science has been an instrument in the expansion and the enforcement of male dominion, whether it's patriarchal or colonial in form. By contrast, ecofeminism, as Shiva writes, quote, locates production and consumption within the context of nature's regeneration, rather than forcing nature into artificial modes of maximized productivity. It's a collaboration instead of an assertion of control, with the living world respected as, quote, an active subject, not merely a resource. Nurturance, not violation, and interdependence, not vampirism, are celebrated as the integrity of all life receives due recognition. Shiva writes that the activation of what has been or is being construed as passive, according to patriarchal perception, becomes the most significant step in the renewal of life. Overcoming estrangement from nature's rhythms and cycles of renewal and becoming a conscious participant in them becomes a major source of this activation. It is reintegration, then, that is the antidote to the ills of reductionism. So the next chapter that I am discussing is titled The White Man's Dilemma, His Search for What He Has Destroyed. The thrust here is that humans as earthly creatures feel an inborn longing for closeness with and integration into the natural world. But since man-made civilization is founded on an ideology of separation from and exploitation of nature, an ideology that is acted upon through practices and technologies of domination, the longing that people feel cannot be satisfied. Its satisfaction would contradict the smooth runnings of the patriarchal capitalist system and therefore can't be permitted. Mies writes that what she terms the white man's project of industrialized, technologized civilization is, quote, based on warfare against nature, and as such is antithetical to peaceful existence within the natural world. The white man's dilemma, simply put, is that he craves something that he cannot have because his entire society is oriented around destroying it. What happens then is that the longing that people living in so-called developed or industrial societies, the longing that they feel is channeled into consumer experiences of an idealized, commodified nature available for a price. Examples would include sort of ecotourism vacations to get away from it all, national parks, zoos, wilderness sports involving all manner of wonky equipment, and so forth. These cultural phenomena simulate integration into nature while still maintaining distance from it through that idealization and instrumentalization. Nature is still for civilized man to use, but now he's using it for recreation or relaxation. What the consumer pays for is a fantasy of nature, bordered in time and lacking any of the real necessity or challenge that true subsistence lifeways would always entail. It's nature on man's terms, packaged for his enjoyment. Interacting with this version of nature, he retains his independence. He does not feel any dependence on nature. It's merely his playground. It's only ever an image of nature that he's interacting with, a romanticized simulation of the real thing, to which people develop a sentimental attachment. Nature is the beautiful mountain revered, while the unremarkable marsh at the end of the suburban road, not quite such a majestic spectacle, is sacrificed to development, paved over, houses are built on it. All the unremarkable creatures who may have lived there are displaced and destroyed. The marsh and its creatures are no less nature than the mountain, but the mountain has value as a romantic image, while the marsh does not. Reverence for the image of nature, therefore, allows for the thoughtless devastation of nature in reality. Mies writes, quote, "Only in the dream of nature can modern man's independence from nature and his imagined lust for nature be celebrated simultaneously. And of course, nature can only be a beautiful illusion, an exhibit or a reservation. This searching for the beautiful illusion of nature protects those who organize men's violence against nature in the name of profit from public criticism and conceals the ugly face of modernity, the war of all against all, the insensible machine-like and corpse-like character of the world of commodities. This beautiful illusion of nature makes this world of machines more tolerable." The illusion also makes man more tolerable to himself, for it serves as a symbolic resource that he can tap in order to express what he decides is his own true nature, as rugged or untamed or self-reliant or any number of other qualities that are classed as masculine and valued in their association with actually a fiction of the primal pre-civilized self. Mies parallels the role of nature within patriarchal industrial civilization to that of women. Like the natural world, women are idealized, converted into images and symbols. However much we are exploited and treated with extreme violence, much romance and sentimentality swirls around the image, the idea of woman. Our bodies, which are loathed in their material reality, are converted into fetish objects and generate an obsessive cultural yearning as such, only in their idealized, which is to say devitalized, essentially deadened form. And the idealization itself is proof of domination, as the natural is coerced into conformity with man's image. Mies views pornography as one example here. In pornography, the female body is dissected into a collection of consumable parts, and it's these parts rendered in hyper-stylized and fetishized modes, not real living women, which emerge as objects of desire. Prostitution tourism provides an even clearer example of the process at play here. What European and American men seek when they travel to an impoverished, post-colonized country to purchase sexual access to the native women of their destination is an experience of primal, primitive, pure sexuality. Again, their fiction of this. The non-white and native woman is the vector for this pure primal sex. She is more natural than the white woman of industrial civilization, corrupted as this woman would be from her supposed animal nature by modernity. Effectively, the prostituted woman within this tourist context is a sexualized noble savage, enticing to men of industrialized societies, not simply because she's cheap and young, though the appeal of these qualities can't be overstated, but because she has been assigned a mythic role in the white man's fantasy quest of his return to nature. Mies notes here too that the prostitution tourism dynamic enables relatively wealthy male tourists to purchase an experience of masterclass status outside of his means back home, where women might be slightly less desperately poor. She writes about men visiting Thailand who pay not so much for sexual use of women as women's service in cleaning their resort cottages and feeding them, effectively serving the men as slaves. At the extreme end of this, Mies writes about the adult baby clients of prostituted women in the prostitution tourism context, who are paying for the women to tend to them completely, not as slaves now, but as mothers, though these roles, the lines between them get rather hazy in the patriarchal scheme. For more on the adult baby sex buyer, I definitely refer you to Sheila Jeffries, who has the unpleasant prestige of being our foremost expert on adult babyism. Anyway, even this coerced caretaking is experienced by men as a return to nature because it's women's natural role to serve men. And the noble savage woman embraces her natural role. She has not yet been civilized into resisting it. Mies then moves on to the general hypersexualization that she identifies as characteristic of male-dominated industrialized society. She writes, quote, "The growing sex obsession apparent in all industrial societies is a direct consequence of alienation from nature, the absence of a sensual interaction with nature in people's day-to-day lives. Men in industrialized societies have so little direct physical contact with plants, animals, the earth, and even with other humans. And their relationships with nature are so mediated by machines that sex comes to be this final frontier of interaction with material reality. The more abstracted and alienated and biophobic men's lives become, the more they fixate on sexuality to grant them a renewed sense of themselves as physical beings. And the more they then hunger after the women and nature that they've cast as symbols of this physicality and wildness and freedom. But the man-made systems through which men access these symbolic entities are commodifying, and commodification negates the authenticity that men are craving. So they chase and chase after revitalization through sex, but the sex is already distorted such that it cannot provide what men are seeking, and the pursuit becomes compulsive and addiction and increasingly bizarre. And sexuality and women as sex objects become targets for men's rage, blamed as they are for thwarting his desires. Reading Mies's discussion of the idealization and romanticization of women as symbols of nature assigned the work of bringing men back to their true selves through sexuality, I thought about how the same dynamic really holds in the case of transgenderism. The man who purports to be a woman holds women as a symbolic resource available to him in the crafting of his selfhood. And that crafting he consistently frames as a return to some lost authenticity. It's not natural femaleness that he covets, but the feminine principle, which is a romantic abstraction superseding biological womanhood in the man-made culture. Men identify with the feminine principle and the image of woman that they themselves have created. They claim womanhood in order to regain something that they believe is true to themselves. And often that truth is highly sexualized. Through womanhood, these men recover their true sexuality. And now we're subject to endless selfies of them in lingerie, that being, authentic sexuality, naturally. This had all been inhibited by the artifice of civilized manhood, and womanhood lets them release it or unleash it onto the world. Again, the sexual element of the desired authenticity is typically at the fore, but men are also keen to use symbolic womanhood to recoup emotionality, sensitivity, motherliness, sort of frivolity and superficiality, or a closeness to nature. And as per standard procedure, the attraction to the simulation is fused to a fundamental contempt for reality. So transgenderism is then rife with misogyny, both ideological and violently enacted, as in angry men's assaults on real women who don't submit to serving as a resource for their self-making project. So the last essay that I'm going to talk about is the final essay in the book, and it's by Maria Mies again, and it's titled "The Need for a New Vision, the Subsistence Perspective." At the end of the last essay that I reviewed, Mies critiques the patriarchal vision of progress as an as an increasing emancipation from nature and from necessity that's achieved through isolation from the living world within architectures of cultural artifice and through the technological control of nature. Yet this progress has so far failed to spawn the utopia that it promised. Instead, the earth is battered, people are miserable, alienated, and/or living in poverty. Oppressive systems have only expanded and harshened. Mies argues that the trend toward postmodernist nihilism on the left, in particular, is a byproduct of this failure. Negating the possibility of transformation means never having one's hopes crushed. It means never having to recognize how bad things have become if you obscure the difference between right or wrong. Without any new notion of progress to replace the faulty one, Mies writes, all that remains is a kind of nihilistic hedonism and individualism, and a kind of critical criticism for its own sake. This position can always count upon being on the right side because it does not take sides at all. Such is the culmination of patriarchal progress, a rank, despairing apathy, an inertia, masked in callous irony, triviality, and casual sadism. The subsistence perspective, then, is the alternative and the counter to man-made society's contemporary malaise, moving as it does in the exact opposite direction from progress as men have defined it. The subsistence perspective, by contrast to a patriarchal malaise, which is not just depressing, but earth-destroying, actually suicidal, the subsistence perspective affirms human life on Earth and reorients human energies towards the nurturance and preservation of aliveness. Mies writes that its vision can be glimpsed in practice in grassroots movements for survival around the world, which oppose industrial development and capitalist extraction. Women are at the vanguard of most of these movements, logically enough, since in most societies, it's women who perform the bulk of the subsistence work that is necessary for basic human survival, work that goes unacknowledged in the capitalist economy, because both women and the material physical existence that they support are disdained as base or degraded in patriarchal thought. Mies explains that women have been the primary victims, human victims anyway, of man's war on nature, and perhaps in part as a consequence, women have with great consistency been the most active, committed, and creative defenders of the living earth. Examples that she lists include the Chipko forest protection movement in India, which began with women bodily opposing clear-cutting by embracing trees that were slated for felling, as well as the women-led anti-nuclear movement of the 1970s and 80s, most notably the Greenham Common Women's Peace Camp. Mies also mentions women's lands as an example of the subsistence perspective in action. These feminist communal living projects, many of them initiated during the women's liberation movement of the 70s, have a strong back to the land, simple living ethos, which obviously fits with the subsistence perspective. But they also promote female self-reliance in another way, psychically, as they give women the conditions in which they can relearn survival outside of socialized dependencies on men and male validation. Both forms of self-reliance are crucial. Neither alone can extricate a woman from the net of male domination. As Mies stresses, the prioritization of subsistence cannot be reduced to a set of behaviors. It's not solely material, but calls for a transformed understanding of the human place within the latticework of life on Earth. It's not just about learning to farm without machines, for instance, but also about the cultivation of a new, or maybe old, maybe long abandoned and pre-patriarchal worldview. Superficial approaches are inadequate. To this point, she criticizes the dominance of green capitalism within mainstream environmentalism, on which subject I would point you to Lierre's book, Bright Green Lies, co-written with Derek Jensen and Max Wilbert. It's I think probably the best contemporary text on the topic. So I highly recommend it. She also writes that environmental or social change movements that take a superficial approach by vying for equality within the system are equally misguided, for they too validate the very system that is doing the damage. Radical feminism has always argued against this oversimplification, in contrast to more liberal feminist strategies that dead end in chasing a bigger and better piece of the pie for womankind. Radical feminism rejects the pie altogether, and so too does the subsistence perspective, as Mies describes it. Both insist on the creation of a new and more livable system, whether the man-made edifice at issue is patriarchy or capitalist consumer culture, what Mies calls the universal supermarket. So I'm going to end there since we're at the halfway point, and I don't want to eat up Lierre's time, so I will turn it over to you.
So this is from the foreword by this woman, Ariel Saleh. I don't know how she says her name. I have no idea who she is. But I thought that the foreword actually had some good stuff in it. So she says, the public is not always clear on the relation between ecofeminism and feminism per se. Clear enough. The mainstream of feminism has many tributaries with different objectives and strategies. The most fundamental form of feminism is expressed when radical feminists highlight the contradictions of women's everyday experience under masculine domination. And I think this is interesting because I would imagine that everybody here agrees that radical feminism is in fact feminism. So she's right, it's the most fundamental form of feminism. What she's getting at with highlighting the contradictions, well, I don't think any of us would actually define radical feminism as that. So it's this sort of odd contradiction here herself. But then she goes on to explain or define cultural and spiritual feminists who celebrate the liberatory potential of feminine values, even as they acknowledge that many such attitudes are historically imposed on women. And then socialist feminism that examines women's economic exploitation. And then liberal feminists seek equal opportunity for women, leaving capitalist society intact. And then the post-structuralist feminists who look at how women are socially constructed and positioned by language and blah, blah, and like, that's not gone well. And then she goes back to ecofeminism. So its first premise is that material resourcing of women in nature are structurally interconnected in the capitalist patriarchal system. And I just kind of slammed the brakes on there because capitalism has not been around that long. Um, so this whole thing where, women in nature get used as resources for men, essentially, that's been going on a long time. I mean, most of us, I would think, probably agree that this has been going on for, 8,000, 10,000 years. So why then does it just get reduced to capitalist patriarchal system? And it would be one thing if they said, okay, well, we're just going to focus on this one kind of patriarchy and the intersections between capitalism and patriarchy and the way that they're interconnected and the way they feed on each other as sort of, two different heads of a hydra or something. I would totally get that. But that's not the sense that you get reading the book. And I hate to jump in with a criticism right away. And this is pretty much my only criticism is that I'm not really sure that they never make that clear. Like, do they get that this has been going on a hell of a lot longer than just capitalism, or not? And I'm not really sure about it because they refer to the older, they refer to the length that this has been happening, and they've got to know that capitalism has not been around that long. So, really, what they're getting at is industrial civilization, and the capitalism is only one version of that. So Jerry Mander named it the technosphere, and Kirkpatrick Sale called it the industrial regime. But the quote that I have here, its existence, this system of industrial civilization, is barely acknowledged despite its near total domination of human affairs on the planet. As Sale points out, the industrial regime hardly cares which cadres run the state, as long as they understand the kind of duties expected of them. It is remarkably protean in that way, for it can accommodate itself to almost any national system: Marxist Russia, capitalist Japan, China under a vicious dictator, Singapore under a benevolent one, messy and riven India, tidy, cohesive Norway, Jewish Israel, Muslim Egypt. and in return asks only that its priorities dominate, its markets rule, its values penetrate, and its interests be defended. And that's from his book, Rebels Against the Future, which I highly recommend. And so the point is that uh, I just don't see capitalism. I mean, it's absolutely an accelerant to all of this, but there's a much bigger system underneath this that they don't quite seem to be naming. And that would be, in this case, industrial civilization. But even further back, you have civilization itself. And radical feminists have already been through this. They've already named this as, at least a source of the problem, if not the source of the problem. And so this is the creation of patriarchy by Gerda Lerner. And Marilyn Ritigliano and I did a whole WDI seminar on that book, which I highly recommend. The book is amazing. And it really does explain, because I know that's always like, well, where does this come from? Is this just naturally what men do and where women are stuck? And she's like, no, there's actually a history of this. There's a before and an after to patriarchy, which means that it really is a political creation and one that we can intervene in and potentially stop. So anyway, sometime during the agricultural revolution, relatively egalitarian societies with the sexual division of labor based on biological necessity because women give birth, that's what she means by biological necessity, give way to more highly structured societies in which both private property and the exchange of women based on incest taboos and exogamy were common. So that's women marrying out rather than men marrying in. The earlier societies were often matrilineal and matrifocal, while the latter surviving societies were predominantly patrilineal and patrilocal. Nowhere is there any evidence of a reverse process going from patrilineal to matrilineal. The more complex societies featured a division of labor, no longer based only on biological distinction, but also on hierarchy and the power of some men over other men and all women. And so this is where the state comes from, starts to exist. And then she says, all this is theoretical speculation, more or less, and now history begins, and it's patriarchy. So this is a much, much bigger and older thing than capitalism. And so I'm just confused sometimes by this book. And indeed, with both of their work, I'm not really sure how much they understand this part of it. And this is making the same point as Jared Diamond. The adoption of agriculture, supposedly our most decisive step toward a better life, was in many ways a catastrophe from which we have never recovered. With agriculture came the gross social and sexual inequality, the disease and despotism that curse our existence. And I really appreciate him for noticing that this is the beginning of patriarchy, because a lot of people who critique this phase, this transition from a more egalitarian society to what we have now, they don't notice patriarchy and all of this, and he does. So I much appreciate that. He went on to win a Pulitzer Prize for his work in this area. So I very much recommend his book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, which pretty much explains most of it. It's not a radical feminist work, but there's a lot of really good stuff in there. So anyway, this is the part that's missing for me in Maria Mies's work and in Vandana Shiva's work, because I'm not sure they get the agriculture patriarchy part of it. So back to this. So ecofeminists may draw on other strands of feminism at times, but liberal and postmodern approaches are generally unhelpful for building global political alliances with workers, peasants, indigenous peoples, and other victims of the Western drive to accumulation. A critically important facet of ecofeminism is that it offers an alternative to the relativism that takes over as capitalist commodification homogenizes cultures. So they paint a contrast between the social decay of past consumerism and then the vitality of skillful and self-sufficient livelihood and of livelihood economies, and that is subsistence. And in fact, there's a whole book I have by Maria Mies called The Subsistence Perspective, which really is the deep dive into this. If this fascinates you in any way, I highly recommend that book. Okay, so they make the claim that all of this, quote, development work has just fueled more violence against women, and she explains why. The economic model, focusing myopically on growth, begins with violence against women by discounting their contribution to the economy. So gets into kind of the heart of it. The production for sustenance is counted as non-production. It's not even noticed as production. The transformation of value into disvalue, labor into non-labor, and knowledge into non-knowledge is achieved by the most powerful number that rules our lives, and that's the patriarchal construct of the gross domestic product. The national accounting systems, which are used for calculating growth in terms of GDP, are based on the assumption that if producers consume what they produce, they do not, in fact, produce at all because they fall outside that production boundary. And the production boundary is a political creation that excludes regenerative and renewable production cycles from the area of production. Hence, all women who produce for their families, children, community, and society are treated as non-productive and economically inactive. When economies are confined to the marketplace, economic self-sufficiency is perceived as economic deficiency. The devaluation of women's work and of work done in subsistence economies of the South is the natural outcome of a production boundary constructed by capitalist patriarchy. And so what happens is it's just by fiat decided that let's say you have a goat in your backyard and you're growing a lot of your own vegetables and you're caring for the children. None of that counts toward the gross domestic product. You may be, in fact, completely self-sufficient for food. You may do everything that's needed for the children and the elders in your life. You are, in fact, keeping life going. You are managing all of that, providing for all of their needs. And it doesn't matter. None of that counts for the GDP. It only matters if you bring it to market and sell it or if you buy it. So over half the food in the world is produced by women doing exactly this, and none of it counts. So it's completely erased. And this has had really dire effects in terms of women's standing and women's capacity for independence around the globe, which means, of course, they are way more likely to be victims of male violence. So by excluding women's work and wealth creation, it deepens the violence by displacing women from their livelihoods and alienating them from the natural resources on which they depend. So the land, the forest, the water, the seeds, and all that biodiversity. None of that counts, which means it's invisible that women need these things, that they should have access to them, that they belong to the people as a whole, and instead they're just scooped up and bought and sold by multinational corporations and with the state. So they work together to take all this stuff away from peasants and from women. Economic reforms based on the idea of limitless growth in a limited world can only be maintained if the powerful grab the resources of the vulnerable. That resource grab is essential for growth that creates a culture of rape. So rape of the earth, of local self-reliant economies, and of women. The only way in which this growth is inclusive is by its inclusion of ever larger numbers in its circle of violence. And number three, economic reforms lead to the subversion of democracy and privatization of government. Neoliberal reforms work against democracy. Corporate-driven reforms create a convergence of economic and political power, a deepening of inequalities, and a growing separation of the political class from the will of the people they are supposed to represent. So I've seen a lot of feminists just sort of in casual conversation use the word neoliberal, and then when we have to define it, nobody can. So I think a lot of us sort of have this sort of general idea of what it means, but we don't really know what we're talking about in terms of just like, what is this? Like, we get that it's bad. We get generally it's about sort of somehow taking things away on a global scale, but what does it actually mean? So I've defined this for you. So economic growth is the best way to achieve human progress. This is what they believe. The free market is the most efficient way, so it gets the most goods to the most people. That means you need minimal state intervention in all economic and social affairs. In other words, the market is going to sort it out. If you just let the market do it, it will do it the most efficient way possible. But what it means on the ground is that anything that's been controlled by the state because it's been assumed to be a social good, that we all agreed generally these things were good, things like healthcare, transportation, energy, those have to be privatized. So the National Health Service, what you have in England, that is got to be privatized. The British rail system has to be privatized. There are places where where the people generally are supposed to own things like oil wells, that has to be privatized. So you have to get the state out of all of this and just let the market take care of it. Freedom of trade and capital. That means that all barriers, all tariffs have to be removed. And what this means is labor protection, environmental regulations, all of these are gone now with the World Trade Organization. And we fought this and we didn't win. So this is now a done deal around the globe. And it means that capital, and particularly, just circulates as fast as it possibly can. None of this would be possible without computers. This is what computers did to us. And this is now global. So neoliberal globalization, the whole world economy has to be one. Financial markets are homogenized and dominated by a very few ultra powerful countries. So all power was shifted upwards when this started, and that's where we are now. And to attract that capital, states are now in competition. They have to provide the best conditions for economic investment. And what this means is they're forced to facilitate privatization and deregulation. So deterioration of wages, environmental regulations, and the social safety net, all that has to go so that the people who own the capital will see that this is the best place to invest it. They're likely to get the most back from it. And so all of the jobs in the United States went to Mexico and then they went to China. And that's in my lifetime what happened in the United States. And now we have the Rust Belt and we have the crisis of fentanyl and opioids. And it's because there are no jobs except in, you've got the cities on each coast and the middle of the country is just devastated. And this has happened all around the globe. So that's what this has done. And it was supposed to be the best thing ever. And people like Bill Clinton believed in it and made it come to pass. And it really is just a massive pyramid scheme upwards. So the economic model shaped by capitalist patriarchy is based on the commodification of everything, including women. When we stopped the WTO ministerial in Seattle, our slogan was, "Our world is not for sale." And economics of the deregulation of commerce and of the privatization and commodification of seeds and food, land and water, women and children degrades social values, deepens patriarchy, and intensifies violence against women. Economic systems influence culture and social values, and economics of commodification creates a culture of commodification where everything has a price and nothing has a value. And that is a beautiful sentence. Violence against women has taken on new and more vicious forms as traditional patriarchal structures have hybridized with the structures of capitalist patriarchy. We need to examine the connections between violence of unjust, non-sustainable economic systems and the growing frequency and brutality of violence against women. We need to see how the structures of traditional patriarchy merge with emerging structures of capitalist patriarchy to intensify violence against women. So these are some examples. The epidemic of female feticide and the disappearance of 30 million unborn girls. You see how old this book was, because the last statistics I read were 160 million missing unborn girls. Surrogacy, reproductive technologies, pornography, prostitution, and trafficking, and especially around industrial extraction sites. So that only just intensifies when you have the man camps. You always have trafficking in women around those sites. So mining, oil, anything that's extractive, where there's groups of men living, they demand prostitutes, and the state usually helps facilitate the trafficking of the women into those sites. So this is interesting. Men are not rapists by nature, nor are they genetically programmed to be killers of our mother nature, the origin of all life. The violence is a consequence of a social paradigm which began some 8,000 years ago. Its name is patriarchy. Although we did deal with patriarchy in our book of 1993, we did not talk about it specifically. It only emerged when the question came up, why patriarchy did not disappear with the arrival of capitalism, or when we had to find a new name for the paradigm that destroyed women in nature. Following Claudia von Wehrhoff, we called this paradigm capitalist patriarchy. Patriarchal civilization is the effort to solve one problem of the male gender, they mean sex, namely the fact that men cannot produce human life on their own. They are not the beginning. They cannot produce children, particularly sons, without women. Mothers are the beginning. So I just find this a little bit confusing. If they're arguing, which I agree with, that men are not rapists by nature, that patriarchy is not our natural state, yet then they seem to argue in the next paragraph that this may be men's nature. They can't produce human life on their own. This seems to create some kind of a void. And the reaction to this is to create patriarchy where men control women, um, and deny that the mothers are really the beginning of it. And I just can't make sense of these two paragraphs in juxtaposition. And these follow, I'm not putting one against another from different parts of the book. These follow on the page. And I'm just not sure which of these things they're arguing for. So I just find this interesting. And here also, they clearly understand that this is 8,000 years old. And the beginning of this is agriculture, which leads to domination of the nature and domination of women, of men over women. And that process has been well clocked out by other feminist writers. Um, and they don't seem to quite understand that. This is the only problem I have with this book is there's just seems to be this gap in their knowledge. So, just, to note, it's interesting to me. Okay, so then this is from another essay in the book, which is so they quote Ruth Seidel's book, Women and Children Last, which opens with the Titanic, and that women and children were indeed first, but only in the first and second class cabins. The majority of the women and children did not survive, and they were in the third class. So she's using us as a metaphor. The global economy has too many locked gates, segregated decks, and policies ensuring that women and children will be first, not to be saved, but to fall into the abyss of poverty. The exclusive focus on incomes and cash flows as measured in the GDP mean that the web of life around women, children, and the environment is excluded from central concern. In fact, I would say it's just completely invisibilized, which of course they know as well. The status of women and children and the state of the environment have never functioned as indicators of development. This exclusion is achieved by rendering invisible two kinds of processes. First, you have nature, women, and children contributing to the growth of the market economy. It's neglected and denied because it doesn't count under the gross national product. And the dominant economic theories assign no value to tasks carried out at subsistence and domestic levels. The whole theory behind the gross domestic product cannot encompass the vast majority of what women and children are doing and also peasants. It's just completely invisible. So that negative impact of economic development and growth on women, children, and the environment, it's unrecognized and unrecorded. And both of these factors lead to impoverishment. And so development as a concept has brought environmental degradation and poverty because it focuses on a model of progress derived from industrial economies of the West. Industrial development in Western Europe necessitated permanent occupation of the colonies by colonial powers and the destruction of the local natural economy. Without colonies, capital accumulation would grind to a halt. And the whole problem with capitalism is that if it's not continuously growing, it crashes. So it has to grow by about 2% a year. This is completely insane because, of course, the planet is limited. Like we only have so many square miles, and then it's over. And they've pretty well taken everything that can be taken. I mean, eventually it will crash. I mean, it has to. So the planet's going to crash. I mean, let alone capitalism. But this is the problem of where this the paradigm of the whole thing was just based on a house of cards that's going to crumble. So because it focused solely on the gross national product, the environmental destruction and the creation of poverty associated with this developmental process are not even visible to the people who created it. It fails to fully measure costs. So for instance, if you clear cut a forest, that adds to economic growth. So it looks good on paper. Yay, the GNP went up. But what it leaves behind is complete impoverishment because the people who depended on that forest are now stuck with a desert. And in order for them to survive, they're going to have to get jobs in a market economy and earn poverty wages and then buy what they need. Now it looks on paper like, wow, look, there's more stuff being bought and sold. The GDP went up. Isn't that great? But in fact, the people have lost their culture, they've lost their self-sufficiency, and the planet has lost another forest. So, in terms of actual death and destruction, it couldn't be worse. In terms of the gross national product, everything looks great. And this is the problem. Such indicators can only measure only those activities that take place through market mechanism, regardless of whether or not such activities are productive, unproductive, or destructive. So taking down a forest looks great on paper, and it's in fact really destructive. Other problems with it, things like the military and the amount of money and resources that go into the military, it completely dead ends because what you're building is a whole bunch of essentially weapons, missiles, nuclear warheads. They're going to sit in a bunker somewhere. They don't circulate. It just literally dead ends. A huge amount of the money and the resources just go into a dead end. So if you're involved at all in the peace movement, these are the kinds of things you're going to hear all the time. Like it's just a dead end. Whereas if you pay people to be teachers and firefighters and I don't know, farmers, that money actually circulates over and over again. And I think that the circulation factor is something like 20. Whereas if you give money to the military, it's only 3. So it just completely dead ends everything into dead weapons. The ideology of development is largely based on a notion of bringing all natural resources into the market economy for commodity production. So what you have is living communities, so forests, rivers, prairies, and the humans that live inside them. All of that has to be turned into dead commodities, and then dead commodities are turned into private wealth. So a lot of my problem with the left is that they think that the issue starts with private wealth, that if that wealth was somehow, um, spread around more, that we would solve the problem. So it's the private part of the wealth that's the issue. Then you've got another group of people who say, well, the problem is that the process of living communities into dead commodities, who does that is just people called capitalists. So if we could have everybody control the means of production and do that transformation, we would solve the problem. And of course, over here, as radical feminists and ecofeminists, no, the problem is the conversion itself. So you've got to back it way up. Um, so these resources, quote, the forests, the rivers, the oceans, they're already being used by nature to maintain production of renewable resources. So the women um, and all the peasants who use this for subsistence and livelihood, it creates scarcity because it takes away the place that they lived and the ways that they were able to sustain themselves. And it creates new forms of poverty, but especially for women and children. Finally, the conventional paradigm of development perceives poverty only in terms of an absence of Western consumption patterns, or in terms of cash incomes, and therefore is unable to grapple with self-provisioning economies or to include the poverty created by the destruction through development. So cash crop production, food processing, by diverting land and water resources away from sustenance needs, deprive increasingly large numbers of people from the means of satisfying their entitlements to food. The paradox and crisis of development results from mistakenly identifying culturally perceived poverty with real material poverty, and of mistaking the growth of commodity production as better satisfying basic needs. So you've got people who are completely self-sufficient and they wear clothes that they've made themselves from fibers that they grew themselves or that they harvested themselves from the wild. And they love their clothes and they have all kinds of native dyes that they use and they have their own weaving and they have their own beautiful textiles that are a deep part of their culture that involve motifs that are about, the goddess and the regeneration of life and the coming of the rain and like all of this is woven into the fabrics that they make. This doesn't count in any way. It's not even visible to this development model. And in the development model, none of that should be there. These people should be going to the store and buying what the rest of us are wearing. And it's a complete monoculture controlled by like Walmart and the Gap and whatever else. And we're all supposed to look the same. And we call that individualism, and it's clearly not. And this entire other way of self-sufficiently creating a beautiful culture that's been in place for thousands of years is completely invisible and indeed on the auction block to be sold because it only counts if the forest and the water is sold. So in a nutshell, that is the problem, and that's what this book is about. So they mistakenly identify culturally perceived
Lierre,
poverty.
sorry.
Yeah, are
Lierre,
we out of
sorry.
time?
We have to go. We have to finish.
Okay. Well, A lot of more slides, but that's basically it. And I highly recommend everybody read this book. So I'm going to stop sharing. Did not get through my slides as usual.
Thanks very
Yay.
much. Thanks to Lierre and Aurora. Sorry, I'm so strict about the time, but I think it's
You
the
got to be.
best.
It's
We
fine.
have to. Great. Bye. Thanks very much. See you next week, everyone.